We are going to make a start. It's lovely to have you all here for our Shabbat lunchtime studio. And in the studio today, we virtually have Professor Andrew Kaye, who's now working at Hadassah Hospital, Dr. Jonathan Taft, Stephen Hacker, and Elisabeth Holdsworth. And we're all going to be speaking to you a little bit about the subject and then open it for your questions and discussions. I'm going to first of all start with some background. And the background really is that we chose this subject. This is actually from the CARE group. And this is a CARE discussion in that we're looking at the coronavirus. And the question we're asking is about after the virus. We've read an awful lot about what's happening with the virus and where we're at with it. And we're beginning to hear about lifting restrictions, and there are going to be some changes, modifications we're going to be announced to us on Monday in Victoria. And it's happening in other places in the world, but it has to be very, very careful as we're going to hear. But before we come to the technicalities, I'm going to tell you why we chose to talk about this subject today, apart from the fact that it's happening all around us. And the reason is that today is the 30th day of the Omer. And the Omer is a biblical injunction that the Torah tells us that we should bring the Omer, and an Omer is a sheaf of barley. Well, actually, it's just a sheaf, but in this case, because it's the second day of Pesach, and Pesach is the barley harvest. So you take your sheaf of barley to the priests on the second day of Pesach, and you start counting. And you count 49 days from there up to Shavu'ot. You count every night as the day starts. Today is the first night of the Omer. Tonight is the second night of the Omer. Tonight is the 13th night of the Omer. Now, last night we counted the 30th day of the Omer. So we're in the 30th day now. And that is the biblical origin of the idea of counting the Omer. We count from 1 to 49. And the next day is Shavuot. And 49, it won't have escaped you, is 7 sevens. And a week is a Shavuot. And that comes from the word seven. So it's a collection of 7. That's where the week comes from. And so the plural of Shavuot is Shavuot, weeks. And it's 7 weeks of 7 days makes 49. So Shavuot comes after 7 sevens. So that's the Omer from a harvest point of view, bringing the sheaf of barley. But as in most of our festivals, the rabbis came along and they added on or amplified and enlarged another tradition as well as the harvest one. And in this case, it was said that Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples. Now, those of you who have done any study in Talmud or study in a yeshiva or anything like that, or been good students of film of yeshiva study or something, you'll know about the word chevruta. In fact, you know the word chevruta because it's the same word as chaver, which means friend. And by the way, the theory is that koba is chaver. The Australian term koba, he's my koba, it's chaver. Probably comes from the Ashkenazi pronunciation that the early Jews would have come here and said koba, machaba. So basically that's a connection. But chaver, we know about it because we have friendship lunches that are called chavura lunches. And at the moment we don't. So this is in replacing our chavura lunch, but that's the word chaver. Chavura, and in yeshiva you have chevruta, and there it means friendship group, but it's a very small group. It's 2 basically. You take 2 people and they become friends and they study Torah together, and that's the process. They look at the text, they have a text on each side of the table, they argue about it, they discuss it, they debate it, and that's why yeshiva is never a quiet environment. Okay, so they're working together, they're talking, they're shouting, they're arguing, they're reading it, and that's a chevruta. So the tradition of working in pairs, it goes all the way back traditionally to the beginning of Torah study. And we call them zug. A zug really is a pair. And in fact, in modern Hebrew, a zug is a couple. So Rabbi Akiva was said to have had 12,000 zugim, 12,000 pairs of disciples, more probably, but 12,000 of them across the country. All of them died at the same time. And the tradition is that they died because they didn't treat each other with respect. They got too argumentative, they didn't listen to each other's arguments, and therefore they died because they didn't deserve to live. It's a problematic idea, we're not going to worry about that. But then it said that the world remained desolate until Rabbi Akiva came to the rabbis in the south and taught them Torah. And they were Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua. And it was they who revived Torah at that time. And the Mishnaic teacher taught that they all died between Pesach and Shavuot. And the explanation was they all died a cruel death. And this plague was, what was it, they asked. And Rabbi Nachman said it was croup. And I don't know if croup is something that kills you, and certainly not in terms we don't call croup a plague these days. But anyway, if you look at Talmud, Yevamot 62b, you will find that story. So basically 12,000 pairs of students, which makes 24,000 altogether, supposed to have died because of the lack of unity that they showed, the lack of respect for each other. The Talmud does not mention that their deaths are commemorated with the yearly mourning period of the Omer, and that comes much later with the Shulchan Aruch. But nevertheless, the idea of switching the biblically happy time, counting from Pesach to Revelation at Shavuot, switches into a time of semi-mourning. And so the reason for that is the death of these disciples of Rabbi Akiva. Now, that's not strictly the full story either, because it doesn't go through the whole 49 days. It actually only goes through 33 days. Now, the reason for the 33rd day seems to be because there's a tradition that Shimon bar Yochai, who was a Mishnaic sage and a leading disciple of Rabbi Akiva who didn't die, he's said to be the person who originated the Zohar and Jewish mysticism. Now, this isn't true at all. We know that actually the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, was written much later, and it's pseudepigraphic, which means that it says it was written by Shimon bar Yochai all those hundreds of years before, and so it was believed to be, and some people still say it was written by Shimon bar Yochai, but we know from the experts that it was not written then, it was written hundreds of years later. But nevertheless, that is why Shimon bar Yochai is associated with Jewish mysticism. And so on this day, the 33rd day of the Omer is a celebration of Shimon bar Yochai and his significance to Jewish mysticism, or some say it's actually marking the yahrzeit of Shimon bar Yochai, although in that case you wonder why you would lift the mourning period. So if you go to Israel today, you will see various traditions. One of them is lighting bonfires. Now, I took a trip to Israel, a group from my previous congregation, the previous congregation that I worked for in London, and we arrived, we flew into Eilat, and we arrived there on the day that evening was going to be Lag BaOmer. So we went to the beach and we collected all the driftwood and we built a bonfire, and we celebrated a bonfire for Lag BaOmer on the beach. And there were fires all over Israel to celebrate Lag BaOmer. And other people go out into the fields with bow and arrow, and they shoot, the kids shoot bows and arrows in the fields on Lag BaOmer. Now, I didn't know what the reason for these two traditions was, either the bonfire or the bows and arrows. That turns out to be a very, very strained connection, really. And it's all to do with Shimon bar Yochai. And the bonfire story is that Shimon bar Yochai was like a light to the world, like a fire to the world. And the Zohar, the Book of Splendor that he's supposed to have written, like a fire to the soul. So that's the bonfire connection. And if you think that one's a bit of a stretch, then try the bows and arrows one is even more of a stretch. And really, it's because there's a story that he was such a brightness to the world that throughout his life, there was never a rainbow because it wasn't necessary. There was no unnecessary rain making rainbows. There was only sunshine and light. And so until he died, we didn't have rainbows again, and therefore bow and arrow. That's an awful long way, isn't it, from something that was nothing to do with Shimon bar Yochai anyway. But so basically the 33rd day of the Omer is actually celebrating Shimon bar Yochai and Jewish mysticism. And so I suppose what happened is that you've got this story of the semi-mourning because of the disciples dying, and you've got the 33rd day of the Omer as a celebration of Shimon bar Yochai. So you can't say, well, you've got to carry on mourning through that period. So basically they said that the plague finished on the 33rd day miraculously, and we celebrate from then on. And you can have weddings, and you go and have haircuts. And in fact, little children have the celebration of their first haircut. You don't cut a child's hair for 3 years. So you see the boys in Mea Shearim with long hair, just like the girls, because the hair grows at the same speed. And they go along to Meron, up in the mountains opposite Sfat in the Galilee, in the northern Galilee. and that's where Shimon Bar Yochai's tomb is. And they go on pilgrimages there, and once a year it's a big festival of Meron, and the kids have their hair cut. Oops, Shirin, that's what it is. Thank you very much, Manny. So that's all on the 33rd day. From then on, we don't have the morning anymore. Most people don't have the morning anymore, but they can have their hair cut, they can listen to music and celebrate and get ready for the celebration. So basically, that's the Lag BaOmer story, the Omer and Lag BaOmer. And Lag BaOmer, if it's the 30th day today, then it is the 33rd day in 3 days' time. So basically, that is why we are choosing today to do the talk that we're doing. So now we're going to go on to the actual subject, which is looking at the coronavirus and the aftermath of the coronavirus, or how we deal with it. And the first thing I'm going to play to you is a very severe warning from Andrew Kaye not to get complacent, to be very cautious as you'll hear about the steps to recovery from this virus.
I think this is the reality is you've got to make a distinction between what governments want to do, quite rightly, to get the economics back, and between what is actually wise for a community to do as a community, to support community activities. And I feel strongly that government should be allowing gradual return to normality. And I'm surprised, in fact, how slow it's been, say, in Victoria, where personally I think it could have been much quicker, because the economic pain is going to be huge from this, as it is here. And you've got to make a distinction between that and what is right for the community, what's going to actually happen for events that are not absolutely essential for the economy. If you talk about the high holidays by September, I see there is no way that we're going to have lost corona from the environment. I think Australia actually is probably heading into a more difficult time, a challenging time now with winter, where not that the normal flu will cause corona, but people will be more vulnerable to it. It'll be harder to distinguish some of the things. It'll be much harder to manage. And certainly, this isn't just my view, but talking to my colleagues in European countries, and particularly I spoke this week to my colleague Franco Servidai, who's head of neurosurgery in Milan. They've been affected very, very badly. And his comment, his plea is, he's so careful once you start getting back into mixing, because you'll get a second wave. And this is a terrible disease. This isn't just like having a bad dose of the flu. To me, there seems to be what I've seen in the are two totally different diseases. There's one disease where it's relatively minor and people can stay at home. It's like having a bit of a flu or a bit of a nasty flu. But there's another disease which is terrible. It's something I have never seen before. I've been in medicine 40 years. I've never seen anything like this before. Basically, we have multi-organ shutdown, where the patients get kidney failure, liver failure, they're getting encephalitis, they stop breathing, they get this very strange pneumonia that's incredibly difficult to treat. Part of it's due to emboli, that is due to blood clots, which actually go to the lung. This is a very, very, very nasty disease. You don't want to be led into a false sense of security by looking at Israel's results, which have been remarkable because of the intensity of their treatments, and particularly for the elderly. And this is what has been remarkable in Israel, how, unlike in other countries, they've just left the elderly to die in the nursing homes. Israel hasn't done that. So Israel's results are even more remarkable, and they put these extraordinary efforts into the 90-year-olds who are frail, and just as much as they would into a 35-year-old. And this is a disease you don't want to get.
So what's your advice? If you just to be very clear, so I will perhaps share this with my colleagues across the UPJ, your advice to us about getting back to services, and particularly high holidays, in brief.
Unless there is a dramatic change in the prevalence of the disease in the community, I think it'd be extremely unwise.
So if we were to think about doing high holidays with the choir and the cantor and the rabbi well spread across the shul, but the rest of it streamed, would that be a good solution?
Well, I would have thought that would be the ideal solution. But I think you really have to wait and see what happens during August. And I think it's unlikely, but if corona was to disappear, which I think is very unlikely, then that you perhaps could do it. But unless it had actually disappeared, then I think it'd be very, very unwise, and it could have a tragic outcome with it. And it's hard to learn sometimes from the past with these, because events don't often match. But if you just look what happened with the Spanish flu and the 3 waves of it, where the second wave, granted it was for different reasons, the second wave was far worse than the first wave. And there were 3 waves of it. The second wave was far worse. Then I think it'd be very, very. Australia has been spared this disease so far. It's really been very, very much background. But it's still, unless it really disappears, unless the community monitoring shows there are no cases, then I think it'd be very unwise.
So thank you so much, Professor Andrew Kaye. We're very lucky to have such expertise within our community, and I'm delighted to say that Andrew and Judy here decided to remain members of ours, even though they've made Aliyah and now live in Jerusalem. But we also have other experts in our community, and I'm going to pass straight over to Jonathan to carry on with the medical aspects, because Jonathan's right here on the ground.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Like Andrew, I'm not directly an expert on infectious diseases, but I've been able to follow it very closely. And I've had, fortunately, the assistance of Professor Sharon Lewin, who's a good friend of my sister's, and she updates us. She's the head of the Doherty Institute, and she's one of the people working on vaccines and other treatments. So I think I'm reasonably up to date as well. I don't disagree with anything Andrew said, but there's bad news and there's also a lot of good news. And I think I'll just cover the bad news first and then come to the good news, and then see what other people think. Now, of course, it's quite a contagious virus. It's pretty contagious. The contagion is determined by a number called R0 or R0, which is 2 to 3. It's the average number of people infected by the virus. It's about 2 to 3 for this coronavirus. That's a bit more than the flu, but not as bad as measles, which is about 10. It's not a new virus. It's an animal virus. It's like SARS, which came and went, and we never got a vaccine for, but it doesn't spread anymore. Doesn't exist. It's certainly true that it affects the elderly very much, and also those the obese, the overweight, and those with hypertension, and Afro-Americans more than Caucasians. In some people, it's a very bad illness, as Andrew said. On day 11, there's something called a cytokine storm, which is an overwhelming immune response. It's paradoxical because it's supposed to affect people who have a low immune system, and yet what caused the lethality is an overwhelming, overproportionate immune response and widespread inflammation in the lungs, kidneys, and heart. And there's no very good treatment. Anticoagulants for the thrombosis has been tried. Steroids don't seem to suppress the immune response. And there's been about 250,000 deaths worldwide. The tragedy is also the economic changes, the unprecedented worldwide shutdown. This has never happened for any infectious disease in the past. This is quite unique. And the spin-off of that, of course, we know mass unemployment. It's probably 20% worldwide, which is loss of education for many months, social stresses, suicide rates, which is probably several times higher than the actual death rate from the virus itself. And the mass unemployment and economic distress is particularly bad in third world countries and poorer countries. Okay, but the good news, and Andrew alluded to this too, only 97% have only a mild illness or maybe no illness at all. It may be unnoticed. And because it's often so mild or inconsequential, the actual infection rate worldwide might be many times higher than the first thought, which means that the death rate is a lot lower than we first suspected. And unlike influenza, it doesn't affect young people, young adults or children. Certainly doesn't seem to be spread by children, and this is the debate going on about children being able to return to school. Bad influenza, by the way, kills about 3,000 people in Australia on a bad year, and worldwide about 600,000 people, while this virus is so far at 250,000. And everywhere around the world, the curve seems to be flattening. There are about 50,000 people ill worldwide with this. That's less than 1 in 10,000. I think that's about 1 of the world's population. So 250,000 dead. Tuberculosis is a much worse infectious disease. It's worldwide the worst infectious disease, and it has been for millennia. Every year, 1,500,000 people die of TB. 600,000 die of malaria every year. 600,000 die of influenza on a bad year. And everywhere at the moment, the world is winning. The curve is flattening and restrictions are being lifted. So the death rate per million, there's some interesting figures. In the UK, it's been 500 per million. But every year in the UK, 10,000 people per million died of just all causes. Italy, it's 480, Sweden, 300, and Sweden's been criticised because it hasn't had any lockdown. It's had some restrictions and distancing, but nothing like other countries. So they're about the middle. USA, 220, although that's supposed to be very badly handled. Israel is only 30 per million. Germany is 100, and they're supposed to be handled well. And Australia, well, 4. That's just unbelievable. 4 per million. And Taiwan less than 1, and that's very close to China and had a lot of travel. In Australia, only 7,000 people total cases, less than that, and very few new ones. Less than 50 people are in hospital, and less than 20 are in ICU, and even only half of them are on respirators. And we've got 7,000 respirators all ready to go. So intensive care units all over the country are virtually empty. The other good news is the so-called second wave that we were all concerned about. Well, there's no sign of that so far. We've got to watch out for it and take precautions and be careful. There wasn't a second wave with SARS either about 10 years ago, or bird flu. And the other good news is a vaccine is very likely. And one of the, about 100 different centres are working on it. But the CSIRO seem to have a very good prospects of a vaccine because they're focusing the vaccine on these so-called spike proteins. You know, the virus looks like a ball with little spiky things sticking out. That attaches it to the cell. Antibodies combine to that and stop it entering the cell and infecting the cell. But the antibody has to be first, because the spike keeps changing in shape, the antibody can't get a grip. But there's a new vaccine that actually locks the spike protein in its shape so that it can't fluctuate, it can't wobble around and change shape. And then the second antibody can lock in on it, and that will be an effective vaccine. So I think that's very likely, and that's likely to come maybe from Australia or certainly someplace around the world. And there's some other treatments that seem to be quite effective already. The antiviral drug that was developed for Ebola virus, that seems to be effective in mitigating the disease and hastening the recovery, although not as a cure. And even things like tuberculosis vaccination, which is being tried also in Australia, may give you a lot of protective effect. And that comes from the fact that if people have had the BCG vaccination, like many of us had when we were younger, seems to give a protective effect, a lifelong protective effect against this coronavirus. So that seems to be effective. Hydroxychloroquine, which the anti-malarial drug, which seemed to be promising, doesn't seem to be that effective, but there's a very good chance that there'll be a vaccine soon. And once that's available, even if not everyone can get it straight away, that will change the whole mood, it'll change the whole dynamics of this disease. So I'm not disagreeing with anything Andrew said, but I think the positives, the good news are really very encouraging. And right now, if you walk in Australia, the chance of catching it directly from another person, because the community rate is so low and the number of active cases is so low, I think it's 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000 of any of us catching it at the moment. So I've got a positive view of it.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to hear and to put it all in perspective for us, especially here in Australia. And of course, there are other concerns going on that we become immune to, all of the other diseases that are killing us and road deaths, which are up again this year. But one thing is, I remember this, we had it with BSE, with the mad cow disease in Britain, where the food minister, John Selwyn Glover, said, there's nothing wrong with our beef. Here, I'll get my children to eat beef burgers. Didn't actually eat it himself. But the point is that there was obviously a slightly increased risk. He said it's no more dangerous than crossing the road, but we have to cross the road anyway. So to add any extra risk if we can avoid it is obviously something we're trying to avoid.
That's true. But also there was the issue of the foot and mouth disease in Britain, where Neil Ferguson from the Imperial College recommended that hundreds of thousands of livestock were destroyed, and I think it's generally agreed now that that was an overreaction, and the distress and the economic hardship that it caused at the time was major. So there is a cost in overreacting too. In some
there is a cost in overreacting, and we have to be very cautious to chart the right line, and that's why we're having the conversation. There's a cost to underreacting, and there's a cost to overreacting. So we need to try and get the right line, and no one can be sure until after the event, of course. You're not, however, looking at the things which are working or seem to be promising, you weren't suggesting injecting bleach, were you?
I don't. No.
No.
Well, no, but the but sunshine, I do recommend sunshine, actually, and vitamin D. I do know a bit about vitamin D, and as a benefit to the immune system, and partly, and being outdoors. There's, speaking transmission, there's virtually no evidence of person-to-person transmission outdoors. It's virtually always in enclosed spaces.
Good.
And,
well, there's not much sunshine out there today. Let's move on now. We'll come back to you with some questions, Jonathan. Thank you so much for that. Very informative and very reassuring, really. So let's go on to Stephen Hacker. Stephen is a member of ours who's on our board, as well as Jonathan. Stephen works at Merrill Lynch Stockbrokers, though you're not directly a stockbroker yourself, but you're in the environment. So, and Stephen, like the rest of us, doesn't claim to be an expert in the area, but we're looking for different bits of input. So Stephen, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Quite an enviable task to be talking about what happens next and what we can expect once things start to return to normal, or a semblance of what normal is. Now, as Jonathan said, I do work for a securities dealer and investment bank, but in terms of economic knowledge, I have no qualifications, and I think the last time I looked at anything to do with economics was probably when I was in university. But I understand the Reserve Bank is predicting GDP to shrink by roughly 10% this year, and they are expecting a rebound of about 6% next year, which, according to some economists, I understand to be quite a bullish forecast. But what is very clear is that the economy is going to be set back a number of years. On the employment front, clearly the sectors that have been hit very, very hard are anything to do with tourism, hospitality and retail. And interestingly enough, I think that they are areas of the job market where a lot of young people are very highly impacted. And John spoke about elevated suicide rates at the moment. And I think that unfortunately, young people at the moment, what I read is that quite a lot of the suicides are happening with those people at the moment. So the extent to which those jobs start to return, I think, depends very heavily on the reopening of tourism. Australia attracts, I think, sort of 8 to 9 million overseas tourists every year, and it's very clear that that will not be happening anytime soon. But I think on the flip side of that, Australians do take huge numbers of overseas trips, probably disproportionately to other countries, and it's particularly puzzling when you consider the amazing domestic travel opportunities that we have on our doorstep, and which a lot of people commonly overlook. So, one saving grace is that once domestic tourism opens up, hopefully we see a lot more people discovering what an amazing country that we have for tourism, and supporting a lot of the communities and people that have lost their incomes as a result of the reduced tourism, and a lot of those jobs returning, hopefully on the back of domestic tourism. But clearly it's going to be impossible to replace the industries that we enjoyed previously. So getting on to, I guess, probably my area of expertise and the interest that I have, that I think actually it's quite interesting. So what I do is I run the back office at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. So I look after systems, people, processes that make sure the financial markets, or our part of the financial markets, keep running. So to give you an example, or some insight as to what my team does, we settle and clear sort of about 7 to 10% of the Australian equities market every day. So all retail stockbroking, all institutional stockbroking, about 10% of that is my team settles that every day, and that equates to roughly sort of 700 million to $1.2 billion in trades that we settle every day. I have another team that looks after our money markets. About a month ago, given the volatility and the huge numbers of FX transactions that are going on, our team settled $20 billion in one day through the money markets. So it's quite extraordinary. And we think about the parts of society that have had massive cataclysmic disruptions or ceased to work. Now, we have carried on, and the financial markets have carried on functioning at this critically important time, but we've had huge disruption as well. So the reason and the way that we've been able to do this is because we have a requirement to be incredibly well prepared for any disruption. We have to have hugely detailed and thoroughly tested and well thought out continuity plans. And as a result of that preparedness, the financial markets have been able to continue on, mostly unaffected at a time where the world and people have relied on us the most. And I think that something that is probably going to be, and I guess the theme of sort of the message that I'm trying to deliver here is that I think the world now probably has a greater awareness of the need for being well prepared for disruptions and unexpected events in the future. And where for me that plays out, and I think it's quite interesting to see, is in thinking about the workplace of the future. And that's, being a manager of so many people across the region, that's where my interests lie, and we're thinking a lot about that. And a lot of these very traditional industries and the ways that we work and the ways that we conduct Saturday morning synagogue services, all this has changed, and it's going to be very interesting, I think, as a society to see what behaviours, whether they are domestic behaviours, commercial behaviours, work behaviours, we adapt to, the things that we are learning now that we're going work well, and quite how that reshapes society. So agile working is a term I'm not sure I'm sure people have heard a lot about, and that's working from home. Working using different technologies, not working traditional hours. So very much a change in the workforce. And I think a lot of companies and people that have been resistant to such change previously have been forced to adapt and forced to accept. And the sky hasn't fallen in. And I think a lot of those behaviours are going to be maintained, and the routines are going to be maintained. And that has vast implications. If companies are not requiring 50% of their staff to come into the office, the impact to public transport and office space, and the retail businesses that rely on those workers being in a location, it's really a reshaping of society. And I think in social themes, how comfortable, how long is it going to take people to feel comfortable interacting with each other and shaking hands with each other, and these sorts of just human behaviours that have been part of our makeup for our entire lives. So it's quite how we adapt from what we've learned over these last few months is going to be quite interesting. And I think playing it forward in the workplace of the future, some of our biggest employers in terms of industries in Australia, professional services and financial services in particular, there is an enormous and very real threat to jobs that is coming very quickly. And that is around robotisation, process automation, and artificial intelligence. And these are going to reshape those industries and provide a huge and direct threat to people who are employed in those industries. And so really it's that theme of adapting to change and showing resilience and being flexible and well prepared in terms of organisations as well as individuals in the workforce. So I think it's very much quite a lesson that is coming out of the current situation for those sorts of things that are going to eventuate in the future. And of course, probably the biggest thing that we need to be aware of that's going to change the world and behaviour, of course, is climate change. And that is going to evolve probably more slowly than the other threats that we've talked about, and absolutely more slowly than the pandemic, which we've been forced to change our world extremely quickly, but absolutely a bigger threat to humanity and the way that the workforce operates. So,
thank you, Steve.
Yeah, hopefully, Jonathan, there's some things in there that are in keeping with the theme. Yeah,
I'm very glad that you got that one in, and I also want to point out that one of the areas I understand that's thriving at the moment in a very flat, quiet market in general is exercise equipment. And we've noticed that Maurice had exercise equipment behind him this morning, and it looked as if you had exercise equipment, and actually looked to us as if you had a metal bar going through your neck while you were speaking. So I hope you're okay. That looks okay. But thank you for that insight and input. I just want to move on to Elisabeth and then leave a few minutes for some questions that might come up, and we'll come back to you. But that was really very broad. Thank you. And robotization is obviously one of those issues, and nobody's yet mentioned basic wage, but I would like to come back to that question because clearly that's one that's been floated around, though not mentioned yet this morning. So let's move on to Elisabeth Holdsworth. Elisabeth was our Leo Beck lecturer last year, and or was it last year or the year before? And Elisabeth has a background, I don't know if we're allowed to say actually. We'll leave it to Elisabeth to say what she wants to say.
I'm a former ADF officer. I'm an intelligence officer. I was an intelligence officer. A couple of weeks, and there's a trope in novels and cinema that once a retired spy is called back into action, to solve the world. In reality, it never happens. It's a dream. Yesterday's secrets are today's knowledge that everybody knows. But what does happen is that former retired senior officers are at times recalled. And about 6 weeks ago, the Australian Defence Force recalled all retired senior officers, and please note this, who weren't demented, who were coronavirus free, who had no other problems, and who had a medical certificate. And I said to my doctor, can I do this? And he said, all right, okay, fine. You've been in hospital 3 times lately, but that's okay. Then, go back. So there's a team of 4 of us who are working to over 24 hours. So we do 6-hour shifts each. There's no weekends off. The ADF doesn't have a weekend off. We work 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And we're all former senior officers. We're all in our 70s. And we were told, right, well, just find out where everybody is, if you won't mind, because we don't actually know where everybody is. And so that's what we're doing. We are working.
So you need to look for the instructions.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That is exactly.
Okay, the problem is.
Sorry.
Done it.
So all over the world, our Defence Force is spread. In fact, very few people are here at home. When you consider that the Department of Defence has almost 1 million employees, a lot of them civilian, everybody is a member of the Defence family. Everybody is being accounted for because we are at war. If I'm frightening you, I would disagree slightly with China on a couple of things. The USSR is on a sharp rising curve of infections. The Chinese appear to have been very successful, but we know nothing about the Uyghur people. The Uyghur Muslim people, there's about 1 million of them, I think, in China, have been sequestered for some time now. They're mostly in re-education camps. We know nothing about them. We don't know how they're faring. We know very little about what's happening in China. We know nothing about what's happening in Africa. The virus seems to be spreading very rapidly. We have people, ADF people, all over Africa. And as we get in touch with each one, we're asking them, what's happening? What do you know? And we pass that on to other people in the Defence Department, who then pass it on to politicians, who then come and ask us, is that really true? It's scary stuff. The advice we have from CEPI, that's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, these are the money people who give money to the WHO. There are 115 candidate laboratories trying to develop a vaccine. None of them have been successful so far because the virus is mutating. It's mutating differently in different places. It's a different virus in America, in Israel, Greece, and the Mediterranean. And John mentioned something about sun, and this may be related. They're doing well because the virus there is the L-type virus, apparently. We don't know for sure. This is something I received yesterday. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm just a hack. Remember that. I'm very good at collating information. I'm very good at passing it on, and I'm very good at, thinking about spatial things. They're my talents. The other thing about the virus is that when as I read this, there is a paradoxical risk of worsening lung disease from a misdirected crossover immune response to the vaccine. So far, apparently, some of these labs are reporting that when they use the vaccine, it causes an even worse reaction. because this is a very clever virus. Viruses do what they always do, and that's mutate. Now, where are we? We are so lucky. We are in this island continent. But our ADF people are coming home. You might have seen that last week. 5 people were brought home from the Middle East, all of them infected. That's only the first of about 30 plane loads who we expect this week. We have no idea what their status is. It's not my business to know, apparently I'm told. Yes, if we are this wonderful island continent, how do we maintain that? Are we going to just prevent the rest of the world in coming to us, or from us going to the rest of the world? Maybe we will for a while. We are preparing in the ADF that we will be in lockdown for 2 years. And I think that's a realistic estimate. But there's something that I want to just finish off with.
Can you just clarify before you finish off?
Yes.
When you say in lockdown for 2 years, what do you mean there by lockdown? Do you mean not having international travel? You don't mean stuck at home?
No, I don't mean stuck at home, but I mean we are going to be, if the projections are right, a society that is partially cut off from the rest of the world, and that's going to be very damaging for our economy. But I do believe in the power of human beings. We are a clever predator, and we too mutate and we adapt, and I just think we will, and I hope and we pray that we will all get through this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. And I misspoke in saying that our speakers, apart from Andrew, were all members of the board, but Elisabeth is so involved with so many things, and the ritual committee and the House of Studies and running the services. So I temporarily thought you were on the board as well, but maybe next time. We're trying to finish in a few minutes time. So basically just asking if anybody would like to ask one or more of our panelists this morning any follow-up questions from what they've said.
Hi, I'd like to ask Elisabeth a little bit more about how this lockdown may look and the types of practical things it may mean. So if we're not isolating, but are we not travelling, or?
I don't know yet. There's another committee that's handling all that sort of thing, and we're the guys who are just doing the accounting, finding everybody, telling them where their families are, and we get copied into everything as a courtesy because we're old, and you've got to keep us happy so we can keep on working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that I know what I suspect, but I don't think there's any point in speculating really.
Quite a range of opinions. It does seem to me that what we are being presented with is that we're going to see some relaxation and some return as we get towards a balance of safety with starting activities as far as possible, but only in small steps and to a limited extent. So at the beginning of the session, Andrew was very clear that until an effective vaccine is not only developed and tested and proven, but also manufactured in bulk, in bulk that will be able to treat the whole world if necessary, and affordably, that we won't be able to have regular business as usual or fully international travel and so on. And if you think about all the areas you've got to go through between here and Europe, it does seem that the flying between here and New Zealand is likely to be the first area to open up.
Well, can I say that? I said I was optimistic about that, but I may be wrong, and there may never be a vaccine. Elisabeth pointed out that the SARS vaccine was abandoned because it caused the same overinflammation, the same cytokine surge as the disease. So we never got there, and that may be the case for this one as well. So we'll have to reach some other sort of accommodation that perhaps just a slow progressive infection rate through the community where 98, 99% of people will be fine, and eventually we'll get herd immunity. That may be the outcome eventually. That's with an ongoing infection rate that we can handle because we.
Does herd immunity work when the vaccine, when the virus is able to mutate rapidly? Because clearly with flu, we're having to have a different vaccine each year because of the mutations.
Yeah, that's not mutation. That's an antigen. It's called an antigenic shift. that's where there's every 10 or 15 years there's a major change in flu A. But that doesn't apply to many other viruses. Measles never mutates, mumps never mutates, and many viruses don't change at all. The mutation they're talking about with this one doesn't seem to change its immune response. It doesn't seem to mean that people who've had it are susceptible again. There's no evidence of that. And if it's more, in fact, it may even be beneficial. Sometimes these transformations make it less lethal, and although it may be more infectious, according to the headline in the paper, it may actually be less lethal, which means that it will achieve herd immunity quicker. So I don't think that this mutation is that likely or that big an issue. It may be no issue at all.
So thank you very much for that clarification, Jonathan. I want to, we said we finish at 12:30, so that's the time now. So I want to thank all of our participants and all of our panelists, Andrew Kaye, Jonathan Taft, Steve Hacker, and Elisabeth Holdsworth. Thank you so much for your sharing your knowledge and your thoughts and your expertise with us. And thank you all for joining us at our LBC studio this lunchtime. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom and be well.